Initially, I struggled to figure out exactly how I should start this video. I could tell you that Friday the 13th is one of the most important and influential horror franchises of the past 50 years. I could tell you that Jason Voorhees is one of the best known and well loved slasher antagonists of all time, whose impact stretches far beyond the confines of these 90-minute movies. I could even tell you that horror cinema, to this day, still owes a fairly substantial debt to these movies. But if you've clicked on this video, if you're a fan of this series, you probably know all this already. So instead, I want to briefly talk about my connection to these films and how that'll affect this video going forward. Because I'll admit, I'm a fan of these movies, I love them, and although I'll be casting a critical eye over each, there are numerous things that I appreciate and enjoy about all of these movies, even the entries that I am less fond of overall. And I wasn't someone who was able to grow up with these films. I've really come in at the end of the line. And even if the remake remains the last Friday movie we end up getting, I'd still say that the whole thing was worth it for these movies alone. But if I'm being completely honest, I doubt that this will be the last we hear of Jason. Because of course, no matter what we do to him, he will not die. He can never die. So, grab your friends, grab a beer, and join me around the campfire for a not so brief retrospective of the Friday the 13th films.
Hello? Who's that? Oh, hi. What are you doing out in this mess?
1, 2, 3,
We weren't doing anything. We were just messing up.
4, 5, 6,
Must be in my imagination.
7,
Can I help you? Hello?
8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Friday the 13th. You may only see it once, but that will be enough. Friday the 13th.
The original Friday the 13th is a difficult film to discuss, especially when divorced from the impenetrable monolith of the horror franchise that it helped to launch. It was both the pioneer of a burgeoning new subgenre of horror and an imitator borrowing liberally from horror's past. It is arguably one of the most important horror films ever made, given both the reach of the franchise it created and the numerous other genre films it helped to inspire, and yet its legacy is irreparably tied to that series and not to Friday the 13th as an individual film. Friday the 13th, in essence, is the series in embryo, not quite fully formed. That isn't to say that I don't enjoy this one or believe it isn't worthy of discussion, I really do. But unlike some of its close contemporaries, John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween being the obvious example for a number of reasons I'll get into soon, Friday the 13th only contains some of the key elements that will form the basis of what a Friday the 13th movie is, and those elements will really only become solidified in parts 2 and 3. 4 will refine those elements to perfection, and then every entry in the series onwards will start to experiment with those elements to varying degrees of success. This isn't to say that Friday the 13th lacks a sense of style or identity, but more to make the point that this identity isn't what forms the basis of the series going forward. It's not entirely what a fan of the series would immediately think of when they hear the name Friday the 13th. I think it's easy to point to the lack of Jason Voorhees as the central antagonist as the primary example of this, but I would argue that this adds an interesting twist to the way Friday the 13th unfolds that people often give it credit for, which arguably makes it unlike any other movie in the series. Spoilers ahead. Obviously, the idea that it is in fact Jason's mother, Pamela Voorhees, who is the killer in this movie, gives this film a unique spin that often more casual fans of the series are unaware of. There is a point made of this in Wes Craven's Scream, in which the killer Ghostface quizzes Drew Barrymore's character about the original killer in Friday the 13th, to which she, incorrectly, answers Jason.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
No, it's not! No, it's not! It was Jason!
Afraid not? No way.
Listen, it was Jason! I saw that movie 20 goddamn times!
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel. I'm afraid that was a wrong answer.
But it also allows Friday the 13th to adopt a different style and set of influences that its detractors often don't really give it any credit for. Of course, I would be remiss to suggest that John Carpenter's Halloween was not a key influence for this film. In the wonderful Crystal Lake Memories documentary, the crew directly admit as such. But the central mystery that fixates on the true identity of the killer has little parallel to Halloween, in that the real identity of the shape is rendered irrelevant. In the film's finale, his mask is knocked off his face, exposing the man beneath. But it simply doesn't matter. The shape is faceless, nameless, the embodiment of pure evil and malice that walks among us. In Friday the 13th, however, the identity of the killer is of the utmost importance. Being able to discover just who is committing these murders will provide a resolution, the essential piece of the puzzle. And in this, I think, the film has much more in common with the Italian giallo film. In case you're unaware, giallo is essentially a subgenre of film that fuses horror elements with thriller murder mystery plotlines. Giallo typically centre around a psychopathic killer clad in black gloves and the attempts of an investigator, usually an outsider not part of any law enforcement agencies, to stop the killings and solve the mystery. The most famous works of giallo arguably come from the director Dario Argento, whose stylish cinematography and engaging narratives helped to revitalise and define the genre. However, it is the work of director Mario Bava who is more likely relevant in the direction and style of the original Friday the 13th, and in particular his 1971 film Twitch of the Death Nerve, which has numerous other titles but is most commonly known as A Bay of Blood. The film features a prominent subplot in which a group of teenagers are all picked off one by one by an unknown killer. Admittedly, this film exerts more of a direct influence on Part 2 in that it actually replicates a number of the murder set pieces present in A Bay of Blood, but its mysterious killer combined with the lakeside setting and teenage cast of characters for a small portion of the movie is the golden age American slasher in miniature. Of course, I don't think A Bay of Blood merely holds interest as a historical object. It's a fantastic movie and I'd recommend you check it out, but it is relevant here alongside the giallo style of filmmaking, informing the basis of this original film's identity and style. Now, I don't want to highlight the similarities between the giallo film and Friday the 13th to suggest that each of the film's sequels, or indeed many of this film's direct contemporaries, are entirely free of its influence. Even if the central mystery surrounding the identity of the killer so essential to the construction of the giallo is abandoned once Jason becomes the permanent antagonist of the series in Part 2. But instead, I simply want to acknowledge the varied and wide array of influences that have resulted in Friday the 13th being designed the way that it is. It pains me to admit then that as much as I admire Friday the 13th's minor twists on the style of the American slasher, that I'm not quite as fond of this as the majority of the sequels that would follow it. There are, of course, numerous elements I could praise about this film. There are some very strong sequences of suspense. Tom Savini, fresh off the set of Dawn of the Dead, contributes some fantastic special effects work, and the final 10 minutes are, arguably, iconic slasher cinema. Betsy Palmer fully commits to the role of Pamela Voorhees and is equal parts a violently deranged serial killer and grieving mother. Her showdown with the film's designated final girl, Alice, is the highlight of the movie for me. I think that Friday the 13th suffers from some fairly severe pacing issues. Even at 90 minutes, this does feel padded out to some degree, as if the writers knew exactly the ending they wanted to reach, but didn't want to rush toward it too quickly. I don't think that these pacing issues are limited to this entry. Although I believe that Part 2 is a marked improvement over this first installment, it still does suffer from these problems to a lesser degree. But they do affect the film in such a way that the rhythm of the narrative sometimes slows to a crawl. But for all its issues and imperfections, I can't help but admire Friday the 13th. Even on its own merits, it's an entertaining, light slice of slasher goodness from the heyday of the genre, boasting some wonderful twists and one of the most effective final jump scares in horror cinema. And when we consider it in the context of the series it single-handedly spawned, it becomes even more of an achievement. But this, I think, was only the beginning of something great, and things could only get better from here.
Hello?
On a June night in 1980, Friday the 13th, 12 of her friends were murdered. Why should Friday the 13th, 1981 be any different? Friday the 13th, Part 2. The body count continues.
Friday the 13th Part 2 is considered to be one of the classics of the golden age of the slasher, a true fan favourite, containing one of the series' best final girls, an incredibly tense climactic chase sequence, some creative kills, and the birth of one of horror cinema's finest modern monsters, Jason Voorhees. And whilst I do have a soft spot for it in many ways, I can't confidently count this as one of my favourites for a number of reasons. Don't get me wrong, this is still a very good movie, one that exemplifies that classic Friday style incredibly well. But I do also think that many of the stylistic elements in play here would be refined further in parts 3 and 4. Let's start with a brief recap of the story so far. Alice, the last survivor standing after the massacre of Pamela Voorhees at Camp Crystal Lake, is butchered in her home by an unknown assailant, who is later revealed to be Jason Voorhees, who returns to the lake to wreak his bloody vengeance on the new batch of camp counselors gathered there. Amongst them is Ginny, who is determined to survive Jason's new reign of terror. Now, how is Jason still alive, and an adult man no less? Maybe don't think about it too hard. Jason works as a slasher icon for me because he is the campfire legend brought into the real world, the imaginary boogeyman of whispered stories and urban myth made manifest. And as such, he doesn't entirely abide by the laws and rules of the real world. Not to suggest that he is a supernatural being at this point. Ginny's psychological tricks at the end of the movie wouldn't be nearly as effective if they weren't based in reality. But that the film is less concerned with grounding Jason in the real world and more with how the real world will reckon with his legend dissolving away into a tangible reality. Admittedly, I don't think this is something that the filmmakers and writers really gave a whole lot of thought to. And it really doesn't affect the progression or direction of the film other than providing an explanation for how Jason has been able to return in the way he has. But it's still pretty interesting to think about, in my opinion. Whilst we're on the subject, let's talk about Jason. This is the movie of his introduction as the series' primary antagonist, but with one crucial difference. Instead of donning the iconic hockey mask, which won't be used until part 3, he instead wears a large burlap sack on his head, which bears a striking resemblance to the design of the killer featured in the early proto-slasher The Town That Dreaded Sundown. This design has its fans and its detractors, but personally I really like it. It genuinely feels like a hastily assembled disguise of sorts, one that is certainly less distinctive than the hockey mask, but one that does better match his environment and his character at this point. Jason isn't the monolithic slasher icon that you would later become. Here, he's just a deranged man hidden behind a dirty burlap sack, but he could be anyone. And this design philosophy extends to how Jason moves and acts in this movie. Although this isn't the relentless aggression that Jason would demonstrate in Part 4, there is an underlying rage and brutality in the manner that Jason moves in the limited time we get with him on screen, and would argue that it sets him apart from some of his close contemporaries. The Shape is a malevolent force of evil, unstoppable and apathetic. There is little humanity or emotion in the way he acts and kills, and Jason Voorhees couldn't be further from this, even in his debut outing. He is all primal rage, fueled by an uncontrollable anger that cannot be reasoned with or conquered by force. Which is why, as is often the case in the Friday the 13th films, the unfortunate counsellors who happen to be in his way meet some equally unfortunate ends. The kills in this movie are fairly memorable, if unfairly curbed by censorship restrictions at the time. This will become a recurring theme in the production history of the Friday the 13th films, and whilst I don't want to bring it up every time, it is worth mentioning. The Motion Picture Association of America were always concerned about the Friday the 13th movies, and forced the filmmakers to cut down the violence in the movies in order to secure the desired R rating. And given that the highest rating, that is, the NC-17, was and still remains essentially unmarketable and wholly undesirable, the kill scenes had to be heavily censored in the editing room, and a lot of that original footage can only be viewed as deleted scenes or is lost for good. While it's not the end of the world and doesn't massively spoil my enjoyment of the movie as a whole, I do think it robs some of these scenes of a little bit of their bite, unfortunately. However, the film goes from being a fairly solid and serviceable entry in the series to one of the finest, with the final chase sequence with Ginny and Jason, which ranks as one of the most effective and suspenseful climaxes in the entire series. It's this wonderfully tense, clever cat and mouse game that sees Jason's brute strength and primal rage set against Ginny's intellect and quick decision making. It serves to highlight each of their individual strengths as characters without sacrificing the quality of the overall filmmaking. It's also incredibly well directed. There's an excellent blink and you'll miss it moment towards the end that I don't think I've seen mentioned before. As Ginny takes a breather in the cabin, believing she has outrun Jason, she stands by a window. The focus, of course, is on Ginny. But at the window, Jason begins to charge towards the cabin. Clever stuff. But the impressive detail is that the music doesn't start up again upon Jason's re-entry into frame. It instead starts upon Ginny spotting him. On a first watch, I was in disbelief that Jason hadn't simply just appeared, and had to rewind and check that his entrance was, in fact, a few seconds earlier. It's a lovely little moment that trusts the audience to be on their toes and doesn't take the opportunity to simply jump scare them, leaving something far more lasting and frightening as a result. Of course, this sequence results in one of the franchise's best loved and most well-known scenes, in which Ginny discovers the decaying head of Pamela Voorhees in a crude shrine that Jason has created. This moment, one that has been referenced and parodied numerous times since the release of Part 2,
Far out, that must be Jason's dead mother. This explains everything.
That must be Jason's dead mother. This explains everything.
Fred, you're an asshole, and that ascot makes you look gay.
has perhaps lost some of its shock through over-familiarity, but none of its power. It's a genuinely distressing sight that forces Ginny to, once again, think on her feet, as she attempts to trick Jason into believing that she is, in fact, his mother. This is the conflict between the pair exemplified in the chase sequence brought to its logical extreme. Ginny making a last-ditch effort to psychologically deceive Jason, not by attempting to physically overwhelm or outpace him, but to outsmart him. I think when fans of the series talk about Ginny being one of the best final girls in the series, this is the scene that they have in their minds. Hell, she only really fails in the end because she is a little too slow to deliver the killing blow to Jason, his aggression and relentlessness once again outstripping her own physical abilities. Even as I praise Part 2 for being a great example of what the series excels at during this period of its lifetime, I also think that there are examples of some of its weaker qualities as well. Of course, I have nothing but good things to say about the third act. Getting there, though? It's not as if the film is poorly paced or bloated by any means. If you discount the end credits, the film actually only runs to about 80 minutes. But I find the cast and a lot of the goings on in and around Camp Crystal Lake to be a little bit dry for my tastes. And while I do wholeheartedly respect anyone who counts this amongst their favourite Friday movies, because I can absolutely see why, I personally don't resonate with it quite as much. For all it does improve upon a great deal of what was introduced in the original, I think that Part 3 and especially Part 4 represent interesting and effective new developments for the series going forward. With that being said though, I can still fully recommend Friday the 13th Part 2 as a slasher classic. Obviously I would advise you to watch them all, but if you want to jump in where Jason is, obviously I would advise you to watch them all, but if you want to jump in right where Jason is, there's no better place.
Weekends are a good time to escape to the woods. Unless the weekend begins with Friday the 13th. Because 13 is an unlucky number. But out here, so are 1 through 12. Because these are Jason's woods. And nobody leaves them alive. Friday the 13th, Part 3. In 3D.
Friday the 13th, Part 3 in 3D. Generally, I find that fans tend to be a little divided on this one. Of course, this entry sees Jason's reign of terror from Part 2 continue, spilling over into the lakeside retreat of Higgins Haven. There's a new cast of characters, a new, funky, upbeat disco song, a fun 3D gimmick embedded into the film, and naturally a new look for Jason, which sees him don the iconic hockey mask that would define his image from here on out. I have to come clean, I really like Part 3, a great deal more than I do Part 2 for a number of reasons. And I think the first lies in the film's approach to slasher structure and pacing. I think that if you want to boil these films down to a simple formula, it would go as follows. There's a brief prologue which is punctuated by a murder scene, followed by about 40 to 50 minutes of character introductions and rising tension as Jason begins to sneak around on new characters before his presence is made fully known in the last third. I'd argue that each of the first 4 movies follow this structure fairly rigidly. That's not a criticism, mind, I like this structure, but it does leave the writers with somewhat of a problem when they come to approach writing that middle portion. How is it that they keep the audience engaged with the narrative and characters before they have to deliver on the climactic finale and moments of horror thrills that the audience have come for? Part 3 provides a number of solutions. The first being that it makes the characters colourful and memorable enough to justify the moments of downtime and rampant tension. There are some strange and interesting detours the film makes outside of Jason's presence and murder spree that ensure it remains entertaining and engaging to watch even when he isn't directly involved in what's happening. The second is the more obvious example, the elephant in the room. The one element that even I, as a strong advocate for this movie, can't claim has aged particularly well, the use of 3D technology. But more on that in a moment. Let's return to that first point, our cast of characters and our narrative. The setup is, as always, fairly standard. Teenagers take a trip to a lake house situated near the notorious Camp Crystal Lake. Again, I quite like the neat detail in that this film is said to immediately take place after Part 2, as Jason's rampage from that movie spills over into this one, and then again into Part 4 that follows this. I suppose that would mean that this technically isn't Friday the 13th, but regardless, it's still an unlucky day for these new campers. The main cast aren't particularly memorable, but I think each is at least sufficiently likeable and engaging enough to carry the film forward. Oddly enough, and this may be the most controversial thing I say in this video, I find Shelley to be the standout member of the cast for me. Sure, he's irritating and fundamentally serves the role of the prankster who tricks and scares people to provide an early shock before the plot has really gotten moving, but I appreciate how he's given enough vulnerability and insecurity to justify this role. He doesn't screw around with people simply because he's a dick, but because he feels undervalued and wants attention, and it's the only way he knows how to attract that attention. I'm not going to claim that the character writing here is particularly stellar, but for an individual that we really spend very little time with, it's a wonder that we have such a clear conception of his personality and identity. And honestly, I enjoy seeing his development from uncertain prankster into someone slightly more confident and self-assured. Until, of course, that development is cut short by Jason. If nothing else, it is Shelley's hockey mask that Jason later steals from himself and adopts as his own, so we can at least appreciate his presence for that alone. Admittedly, the most interesting characters and narrative diversions actually end up coming from outside the core cast. There's a scene in that middle portion of the movie in which Shelley and Vera go to the local store and encounter some bikers, who easily provide the best scenes that do not involve Jason in the movie. The standoff with Vera and Shelley inside the store is tense and engaging, and when it spills out into the parking lot, the steady escalation of the conflict is surprisingly thrilling. Again, the pure narrative function of these characters is simply to get them to Higgins Haven so that Jason will have more victims to kill. But I enjoy part 3 quite a bit because it is less obvious and more unexpected in how it wants to move these narrative elements into place. We don't really need the diversion with the bikers and their conflict with Vera and Shelley. They could have just come across Higgins Haven and explored the grounds for Jason to make his move. But I appreciate its inclusion given that it offers colour and variety to the film's structure. Whilst we're on the subject of character, I should also say a brief word about our final girl this time around, Chris. In the original plans for part 3, Amy Steele was expected to return to reprise the role of Ginny, as Jason returned to finish what he had started in part 2. However, Steele turned the role down and the character of Chris was written instead. Now, I mention this because, if you'll allow me to engage in a brief moment of speculation, I believe that some of the remnants of this original plot still exist in the final product that is part 3. Chris's backstory, revealed late in the film, involves the revelation that she has encountered Jason before, who had attempted to attack her in the woods. And personally, I've always found this scene to be a little odd. Jason is rarely depicted as someone who lets his victims live, and yet Chris escapes unharmed while seemingly being defenseless against Jason. It's a moment that feels a little out of place, intended to create somewhat of an artificial connection between victim and killer to fuel the stakes of the finale. But this strained attempt to make that connection makes far more sense, in my opinion, in the context of the relationship that Ginny and Jason share in part 2. I imagine we may have seen a similar scene recapping the events of part 2 from Ginny's perspective instead of this new backstory had production gone ahead as it was originally planned. Again, this is pure speculation on my part, just an attempt to make sense of a sequence that never quite seemed to fit in the film as it is. Now that we've had a look at the film's different approach to character and narrative, it's now time to address that elephant in the room, the implementation of early 3D. Admittedly, I don't find this nearly as egregious or intrusive as some people seem to. Don't get me wrong, it's exceedingly obvious, and perhaps a little more frequent than it should be. There are certain shots that feel especially unnecessary outside of this desire to be constantly demonstrating that the film does, in fact, use 3D. But it never hindered my enjoyment of the movie in any way. It also helps that the film doesn't directly call attention to it or attempt to work it into its overall narrative, a la A Nightmare on Elm Street's foray into 3D at the climax of Freddy's Dead.
Get ready with your 3D glasses when you see this scene.
Hell, I can imagine that seeing this in cinemas in a 3D screening may well make the film even more entertaining. But as is, I don't think it's something that particularly damages the film overall. The 3D also works its way into the kills in this movie, which are strong, but not quite as memorable or as lasting as the ones in part 2. The axe scene and bedroom stabbings are highlights, and although I do firmly believe that this is a stronger overall film than part 2, the finale to this film is severely lacking in comparison to its predecessor. It's perfectly fine and is fairly tense when it wants to be, but it's not quite that steady building of dread exploding into the wonderful chase sequence that we got in the previous film. Overall, if you couldn't already tell, I have quite a soft spot for part 3. It's my favourite film in the series thus far, and I think that its setting, cast, and certainly its visual iconography make it more than a worthy addition to the Friday the 13th franchise. But this original stretch of film still had one more entry, and although Jason lies still at the close of this movie, an axe buried in the centre of his mask, it seems that he still has some life in him yet.
times before, you have felt the terror, known the madness, lived the horror. But this is the one you've been screaming for. Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Jason is back.
So, here it is, the final chapter, the ultimate fan favourite, the entry that gives us the most refined and confident rendition of the traditional Friday the 13th style. I would personally argue that this has the best cast and narrative of the movies, the tonal confidence to include both memorable comedic moments as well as delivering on the horror, and possibly one of the best depictions of Jason, who is this ferocious, hyper-aggressive, unstoppable monster of an antagonist. If you couldn't already tell, this one is my personal favourite, and this is coming from someone who already really likes the vast majority of these movies. I think it's a testament to the effectiveness and success of this particular entry that every new film to come after this stops trying to replicate the traditional Friday structure that has slowly been improved upon and developed over the past 3 entries. For better or for worse, from here on out, every new Friday movie will try something a little different, have a new spin on the premise. Even the entries that are not quite so radical as Jason X or Jason Goes to Hell still include distinct and fresh ideas that set them apart from the relative realism and traditional slasher style that defines the first 4 entries in the series. A New Beginning is, of course, the turning point in this, and it becomes more relevant when we come to discuss that film, but it's still important to note here. The plot this time around is actually a little more involved than any of the previous entries, set between 2 locations close to Crystal Lake. The first involving the Jarvis family, and the second encompassing a group of teenagers who are staying by the lake. After the events of Part 3, Jason is rushed to the morgue, presumed dead. But he awakens and returns to Crystal Lake to terrorise those who are left. Just a side note, there's a neat detail in Jason's visual design throughout this film that the axe blow that originally seemed to kill Jason in Part 3 has actually left a large bloody dent in Jason's hockey mask. It's a small design choice that really goes a long way in making both these films feel more interconnected and fleshing out the world that they take place in. And this level of detail and consideration can be felt all over the construction and style of Part 4, and most specifically in its characters. I firmly believe that this is the best cast of any of the Friday the 13th movies, and I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement either. Let's start with the Jarvis family. Already, they're an outlier in that each of these films primarily involves groups of teenagers, to better represent the audiences that these films were originally targeted at. There have been older couples and families as minor side characters in previous movies, but usually they're just more victims pushed in front of Jason to bolster the movie's body count. Here, they're arguably archaic characters, particularly in the case of Corey Feldman's Tommy Jarvis, an intelligent young boy with a penchant for video games and special effects design who is forced into battling Jason at the film's close. Tommy is one of the shining examples I can give of why I'll argue that this film's character writing is one of its greatest strengths. For the fairly limited amount of time we spend with him, we get a distinct sense of who Tommy Jarvis is pretty much immediately, and his ordeal with Jason is presented with empathy as much as it is with horror. Of course, the climactic final sequence is thrilling, one of the series' best in my opinion, but we never lose sight of the intense psychological effect that it inflicts on Tommy. The Jarvis family as a whole are presented as a fairly healthy, well-functioning family unit. They're defined more loosely than Tommy is, with the same degree of empathy and vulnerability. What works in the final chapter, for me, is that the film introduces characters that are likeable and engaging, but then shows them in these small moments of privacy and vulnerability. The real things that people think or say when they believe that they're alone. And it honestly transforms them from loosely defined character archetypes into real people with genuine fears, insecurities, and vulnerability. Qualities that aren't always obvious, but are always there. From the main cast of teenagers, I'll use Crispin Glover's character, Jimmy Mortimer, as an example. Early in the film, his friend pronounces him to be a poor performer in bed, or, as he puts it,
"It says you're a dead fuck." What? A dead fuck? A lousy lay. You know,
dead
Oh, I see. Oh, don't hold it back from me, Doc. I can take it. Give it to me straight.
A small comment that seems to weigh very heavily on Mortimer's mind throughout the movie. As we follow this character through the film, watching his attempts to overcome his insecurities, step out of his comfort zone, and occasionally bust some of the finest dance moves this side of horror cinema, we begin to root for him, to want to see him feel some sense of validation and self-esteem, because he's awkward and strange and doesn't always get things right, but you inevitably become invested in what is going to happen to him. And eventually, as these films always do, he's paired off with one of the girls in the cabin, who assures him that he is in fact okay. And he descends the stairs, shouts out for a corkscrew, and...
Ted! Ted! Hey, Ted, where the hell's the corkscrew?
Because this is, after all, still a Friday the 13th movie, most of these characters are not going to survive very long. The final chapter develops an odd point of tension in that the bloody massacre is the thing you've come to see, the reason you've decided to watch a Friday the 13th movie. And thanks to the wonderful work of special effects legend Tom Savini, these are the best kills in the series, equal parts gruesome and terrifying. But you become attached to these characters to a degree that you don't entirely want to see them slaughtered, and thus Jason becomes an entirely new, or more evil and menacing presence, a harsher, bleaker form of horror. It certainly helps that this is easily the most vicious, aggressive rendition of Jason in the series thus far, crushing people in his bare hands, sprinting through the cabins, busting through doors using his entire body weight. It's almost as if Jason is expending all of his energy in this last gasp attempt to unleash his anger upon the world. It's a uniquely terrifying take on the character that pushes his potential further than it ever had been before. His kills, of course, were trimmed by the MPAA once again, but this is arguably the only film in the series that you wouldn't know had been cut. Jason's death is undoubtedly the goriest scene in the entire series, a fitting end for this iconic movie monster. And sometimes the trimming actually heightens the impact of certain scenes. The death of Crispin Glover's character always sticks in my mind because we only ever get a split second to register what has happened to him. Jason truly does emerge from nowhere, and the shock on his face that we only glimpse for half a second is heartbreaking. Of course, the final chapter isn't entirely punishing and bleak. Its moments of horror are arguably the most effective in the entire series in that they're allowed space in which to breathe. But there are numerous instances of levity that ensure the film never becomes a dull slog. The aforementioned dance by Crispin Glover is a great example of this, but there are some stranger instances that are more difficult to pin down. The infamous cry of, "He's killing me," as a robber is murdered, and the odd shot in the finale of the Jarvis family dog leaping out of a second-story window for no discernible reason whatsoever. I always find this moment very funny, but there really is no precedent for it. It has no relation to the rest of the film. I can only assume that it was intended as a moment of absurd humour amidst the chaos and violence of the finale. But I think that, in a nutshell, is why I love the final chapter so much. It feels undoubtedly messy and strange at points, but behind it all there is a heart, a real passion for the series and appreciation for why it works as well as it does, how strongly it can resonate with people when it's at its best. And I would personally argue that the final chapter is the series at its finest, the perfect capstone to the original run of films and that traditional style, whilst leaving the door ajar for the more experimental projects just down the road.
In all those mysteries,